Good morning, good evening, everyone. 90% of the data that we have access to today was created in the last 2 years. Every day, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data is added. That's 18 zeros. A billion only has 9 zeros. So you can imagine the amount of data that's getting added every day. We're seeing similar addition of data when it comes to supply chain risk intelligence, when it comes to third-party risk management. So how does one take this data, this intelligence that you're receiving on risk, and actually make this actionable? We're very fortunate today to have a great resource that's joining us. Jim Routh is the former Chief Security Officer of MassMutual, CVS, Aetna. He's led risk at organizations like JP Morgan Chase, KPMG, DTCC, American Express. And so he brings this 40 years of risk leadership in cybersecurity, in operational risk management, where he has helped build world-class risk management programs that not only leverage this intelligence, but use data science and automation to actually enable risk actions, create a very effective risk organization. Jim, welcome.
Atul, thank you very much. Really happy to participate in this forum.
Wonderful, Jim. And again, thanks to the global risk community for hosting this. And to give you a quick background, I am the chairman and founder of Supply Wisdom. Supply Wisdom provides continuous risk management and automated risk action for companies globally. So Jim, one of the things that I wanted to start with is, very clearly, COVID accelerated the need or the visibility into how organizations needed to be better at third-party risk management and be more resilient. At the same time, if we think about our world today, we're seeing significant disruptions in business operations, and you have a couple of decades of experience in operational risk management. If you reflect on that journey, Jim, what have you experienced around business disruptions?
Well, Atul, I'll tell you what comes to mind immediately from my perspective is I think about the fundamental mistakes that I made when I implemented my first third-party governance program, and it was close to 20 years ago. And I think about those mistakes because they're largely amplified by fundamental changes and the evolution of risk in third-party governance. But mistake number one was clear. I had a one-size-fits-all model. So I had thousands of third parties that provided different products, different services, and frankly had very different risk profiles. Yet I had a one-size-fits-all model where I was looking at assessment information that was consistent across all of them, usually in the form of a painful questionnaire that inflicted friction on them and gave us something to work with. And then through the annual assessments that we did, and most of the annual assessments involved a data center tour. And I got sick and tired of looking at data centers all day, but essentially those were fundamental mistakes. I didn't know it at the time.
Right.
And certainly today, as we look back, it seems silly, right? But that's kind of the way it was. And I would say that there are a lot of enterprises today that are still using those conventional controls in a one-size-fits-all model. And it's just not practical. And frankly, the irony is that we think about operational risk has always been data intensive, always.
Right.
And yet our application of operational risk for third-party governance has really not been data intensive. So that's another mistake, if you will, that I made way back when. Today, we've got climate change driving really extreme weather events in different parts of the globe at any particular time that have the potential for disrupting our supply chains. And that's going to continue to evolve going forward. And so the increase in nation state sponsored cybersecurity attacks that have a collateral effect on the private enterprise today, that's also increasing. The volatility of financial markets increasing, political instability. These are all things that make third-party governance from an operational risk perspective fundamentally different today. And we're using this legacy of control management procedures that are obsolete.
Thanks for that, Jim. So very clearly, the need is rising. And so what I'd love to do is talk about challenges next. But before we do that, I want to remind the audience, please use the Q&A or the chat functions to ask questions, or if you have any experiences you want to share, feel free to do that also. So Jim, let's talk about the challenges, right? So the need is very clear. That when I think about risk management solutions in the market, and it's one of the reasons why I kind of jumped into this space to create a company, was I noticed the challenges with point-in-time assessments. They became stale very quickly. You talked about geopolitical, very few companies really interlink their service provider risk to their location risk. And so they were not really monitoring location. And COVID actually showed that quite a bit of how many companies were ill-prepared. So Jim, when you think about your experience with risk management solutions that are inadequate, what else do you see as kind of limitations of these older risk management solutions?
Well, I think fundamentally the inputs from a data perspective are static and periodic. And so, and typically, I mean, this is kind of the way it works in most third-party governance programs. You've got limited resources that support the risk analysis function, and they're struggling to keep up with the demand in the procurement pipeline. And there's always a few companies that happen to be the pet projects of the chairman and CEO. And of course, those get, ratcheted up in priority, and you're quickly, putting your best resources on them to do and complete the security assessments that's part of the procurement process. And then of course you have the other projects that are required in the procurement process. They have a lower kind of priority on a relative basis. And then by the time, you get to all of them, which often you don't, but by the time you do, then you have to do the recertification. And the recertification has to be by risk, right? So you're the top vendors by risk. You have to have some sense of that. And of course, you're using static, and periodic data to make that determination. And the environment's very volatile. And then at the end of the day, no third-party risk function has enough resources to do what's on their plate today, much less deal with emerging risk that evolves. So it's a zero-sum game for most enterprises, simply because they're resource-starved, trying to keep up with all the questionnaires that are going out.
Yeah, Jim, I think that summarizes the challenges risk leaders face today really well. Interestingly for me, I know the audience is really there, Jim, to hear from you on solutions. So we're going to jump to that in a minute. It's interesting how kind of your journey, I remember it was 2017 at the Shared Assessment Summit, right? Where here I am in my early years in developing the risk management solution and talking about continuous monitoring. And here you were on stage talking about the evolution of risk management and how risk leaders needed to be focused. And I felt like I no longer needed to evangelize, because here's a leader that's already adopted it. Tell us a little bit about how did you get to that conclusion in terms that you needed to move the model even as early as 2016, 2017?
Well, one of the first things that I did is recognize that operational risk is a data intensive process, and frankly, third party risk management for cybersecurity and for resilience, just business resilience, needed to be a data intensive process. We needed much more effective data and real time or close to real time data. So, that was absolutely, critical. What also there were seminal events that happened. There was a supply chain poisoning that took place where the fundamental supply chain disrupted many, many businesses by planting malware and spreading that malware through the supply chain that really brought many businesses to basically unable to operate. Now, this sounds very familiar because all of us have been reading about SolarWinds, but what I'm talking about was NotPetya, which was exactly the same thing. In fact, it was initiated by a nation state attacking another state, and the collateral damage involved major companies. Merck, as one example, lost 15,000 servers that were compromised, bricked, and just totally non-functional in 90 seconds. Now, no human can respond in that kind of time frame in the enterprise. So we all kind of woke up to the fact that we needed data in a real time, near as close to real time as possible across a number of dimensions. And we needed not only to be able to analyze that data, but we actually needed to turn that data into some action through automation. And that gave us an ability to take the risk intelligence in close to a real-time fashion and create specific responses that were automated, allowing the scarce resources for business resilience across the enterprise and third-party risk management to then focus on where the highest risks were at that point in time, recognizing that change. And it was a bit of it's a game changer. And so when we break out of our conventional constraints around a one-size-fits-all model driven by annual assessments, we can start to look at multiple data feeds across many dimensions and let that trigger a series of automated events, and that connecting the intelligence in real time to the automation of workflow, we actually free up resource to be more thoughtful about where they apply their time and how they implement controls.
So Jim, this is really good. What I'm going to do over the next few minutes with you is let's pick these threads one at a time. So we'll start with focus on continuous monitoring and kind of the scope of risk one needs to look at. I love your thoughts on that. The second piece is then talk about kind of how do you actually use data science to take a continuous model and make sense out of that. And then finally, how do you make sure that you can actually automate these risk actions? Like you said, in many cases, like Petya or not Petya or SolarWinds, impossible for humans to take that level of action. Fair?
Yeah, so let's start with the first is there are multiple data elements that we wish to absorb, especially, the reality is the level of interdependence between the enterprise and third, fourth, and fifth parties has increased exponentially in the last decade. And so we're much more dependent upon third parties. So we have to think about the fact that there's a community of third party, fourth party, fifth party providers, and we're all interdependent. And so we have to think in terms of applying information through multiple sources. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model. I think there are multiple sources across different dimensions. And then to the degree that we can respond to the inputs with, instead of every single action requiring a human to provide context and then determine what the appropriate action is, if we can create a risk score for each entity fed by multiple sources, that risk score, which is just a numerical representation of an event. And,
Right.
and by the way, I'm touching on some fundamentals of data science that we all learned whenever we took statistics when we were in either high school or as an undergrad. We all learned you can take any event and put it on an X and Y axis, right? So we could represent numerically any event. Now that's kind of a cornerstone for any kind of operational risk management capability, because now that we can represent that numerically, we can take multiple inputs across multiple disciplines and come up with a single risk score for that entity. And that risk score, because it's a numeric representation of the risk at a point in time, we can establish a threshold. The threshold could be, on a scale of 1 to 100, if I said 70 was the threshold, I could say if I have a score above 70 or above, then I'm going to automatically take a specific action. And I'm going to trigger that action based on when that score goes above 70. And I'm going to automate the workflow to initiate that action. Now, what I've done is I've eliminated the need for the human to digest the information, put context around it, and then figure out what action to take and take that action. I've eliminated all of that. So now, in close to real time, I'm triggering an automated event based on a change to the risk score. And all of that is happening with no human involvement whatsoever. And the more I can apply treatment in an automated way, it frees up my scarce resources in the enterprise to analyze the entire workflow and decide where to apply the human to the establishing the context and assessing risk. And that's a game changer, because it means that you can increase the breadth of your coverage from an operational risk perspective for more and more third parties without adding critical, essential resources with high level of skill. And so you have a whole model that's far more effective, and it's a better utilization of resource. And that's kind of the end game. That's what we want to do. We want to not only increase the scope of third, fourth, and fifth parties, looking across multiple dimensions of resilience for the enterprise, and ultimately use our knowledge and our capabilities from a resource perspective to help the community members by providing them some of that information and encouraging them to take the right steps, which improves resilience across the entire enterprise.
Thank you for that, Jim. Jim, I think it's important to also reinforce that while this sounds aspirational, it's actually being done. You put into place, we put into place. So it's important to recognize that. Jim, I want to kind of take a step back for a little bit. You talked about the kind of the starting point happens to be near real-time continuous data. And I wanted to just poll the audience because it's interesting for me. Even today, when I have conversations with risk leaders, sometimes they'll tell me that, oh yes, their model is continuous. And then when I probe further, I realize they're using the once a year as actually saying that's continuous. And I think what we mean here is not a quarterly or a once a year being continuous, but it's being near real time, all the time, live monitoring. So the question I wanted to ask the audience, and I'm going to open up a poll for everybody to respond to, is do you continuously monitor those third parties? So let's limit it to third parties at this point in time, not the fourth or fifth or nth parties. Do you continuously monitor those third parties that represent the highest risk for the organization? So you'll have three choices, yes, no, or it's in future plan. And I'm making the poll live for you at this point in time. So I encourage all of you to please respond. And then I'm going to ask Jim to kind of give us his thoughts on what he sees in the responses from you. We have about half the people have voted. So Jim, as you see the poll, I'm gonna close the polls in about 30 seconds. So Jim, as you see the poll, and I'm gonna bring it up. What's your reaction to these poll results that 36% say yes, they monitor continuously, but there's about 64% that either don't or do have a plan, but they're not doing it currently?
Yeah, the reality is I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged because I thought the numbers for those that have kind of evolved their programs to do this would be lower. So I'm actually encouraged by these numbers. The fact that 32% have it in terms of their future plans, and 16 or 36% are doing it today. That's actually very encouraging. The reality is we in enterprises, and especially larger enterprises, it takes time. It takes time to fundamentally change behaviors and practices. Even if you have, outstanding data sources, just connecting the data sources to an understanding of the data science of measuring risk with multiple inputs, and then automating the actual actions from that. We're talking about changing workflows across large enterprises. Nothing happens overnight. So I'm actually somewhat encouraged by these numbers. Now, I'm naturally skeptical because I come from cybersecurity, right? But I'm a little bit optimistic about these numbers, and I feel encouraged by them.
Wonderful. So Jim, you just said something. You have a background in risk, in operational risk, but also over the last couple of decades, also focused on cybersecurity. Often when we're having conversations with risk leaders, particularly CISOs, there are a few that we hear from that talk about that I need to expand my risk aperture. It's no longer enough for me to just look at cyber. Talk to us about, first, why CISOs and risk leaders really need to widen their risk aperture. And then I have a couple of follow-up questions on ESG.
Yeah, so we talked earlier, Atul, about kind of the drivers of change and really across enterprises globally, weather and climate, market volatility, political unrest, the fact that we have such a large percentage of the population globally that are migrating as a result of weather or political events. And we're going to see that increase. And of course, these are in developing areas. And where are the lowest cost labor resources that we're trying to leverage? They're in developing countries. So there's a whole number of factors that just fundamentally change risk profiles, and we have to be able to respond to that in real time. And so it takes just like any implementation of new infrastructure, process, and workflow, it takes time to digest that for an enterprise. But over time, what happens is you, the enterprise, can do much more with less, much more with fewer resources. But you need to put the implementation effort in place, and so that may be an investment of resource in the short term. Might have to invest in some software to do that, and then go through the engineering of the data science connected to the automation. But the end result of that will be far greater coverage, much more responsive capability at a lower cost, simply because the labor costs will be so much lower.
Right. So Jim, very clearly you kind of following this whole path from getting more intelligence and the need for greater intelligence, not just cyber, but really this wider aperture. So let me stay with this topic, and I'm going to jump onto data science and automation right after this. So we look at the new US administration, right? And so January 27th, an executive order focused on climate change. February 24th, if I remember right, the right date, executive order on supply chains and the poisoning of supply chains. And then the SEC on March 3rd with a directive that they're going to look at ESG disclosures more so this year than ever before. Let's talk about ESG, Jim. You talked about geopolitical and weather. Do you see ESG again as a purview that risk management needs to adopt, especially as they look at third-party risk management? Or is this something that you see kind of a movement that procurement or somebody else ought to be dealing with?
No, this is clearly in the operational risk sphere. So, and frankly, for third-party governance, most of what we do touches or involves procurement. So some of those automated treatments that I was talking about involve procurement. I'll give you a specific example of that. And this was implemented at two companies I did previously, and it got really good results. So the first thing we did is whenever a risk score was triggered and increased significantly, and we were focused initially on cybersecurity risk, that risk score included something called responsiveness. And it was a subjective measure, and it's basically if we and the enterprise sent out information about something like a SolarWinds kind of event, and we were seeking information from our community, those members that shared that information actually got a higher response rate or higher response score as one of the indicators of risk for the end. And a higher response score was actually a lower risk. So the ultimate risk score went down when the responsiveness was high. Conversely, those enterprises that never responded got a higher risk score as a result of that, as a net effect. And in some cases, if the risk score triggered above a 4.0 on a scale of 1 to 5, we would automate a workflow process through procurement where we would send a generic RFP out to 2 other suppliers that provided the same type of service or product as the vendor that triggered the risk score. And the 2 other suppliers would respond, and the relationship owner could choose could ignore the RFPs or could actually engage the other 2 suppliers to see if there's a better way of improving the service. All of this triggered largely based on the responsiveness of the third party. Now, what happened is 9 times out of 10, the verbal word got out that we were going to market looking for new services. And the vendor that had the low response score discovered this, saw that, oh, well, I guess they're serious about it, and immediately improved their level of responsiveness. And all of it was triggered through workflow that didn't require a human to do anything. It was literally an email that went out with a generic RFP, and nobody had to touch or do anything. It was totally automated. And that's an example of kind of risk-triggered events driving automation that didn't require any labor, that actually over time reach sustainable behavior or influence sustainable behavior, in this case for the third party. So so that's an example of this, and it's all based on this notion, and you have it on the screen now, where there are different dimensions and categories of risk, and you can, you know, add responsiveness as an example, but you can look at financial risk, people risk, client risk, you know, region risk, geographic risk, and all of that factors into a score at a point in time that's representative. And of course, if you look at that across the entire portfolio, you can look at the portfolio score, which is an aggregate of all the vendors within that portfolio. And if you decide to divide your portfolio into types of products and services, each segment can have its own risk score, and you could trigger actions based on changes to that risk score, as opposed to let's find out how many have to recertify their annual risk assessment, you know, based on doing a data center tour that's absolutely useless today because everybody's using cloud computing. So that's the beauty of this.
Jim, that was actually a great example, the whole sourcing example you used, because too often when you start talking to people about risk action automation, their mind goes very quickly to patch management, leak credential, and others, and not recognizing that when you think about a wider risk aperture, financial, ESG, geopolitical, and others, that in many of these areas, there's a number of actions that one can actually automate. Jim, interesting. I'd love for you to comment on this. So one of the things that we saw companies do when the SolarWinds breach happened, that as the third parties were disclosing that they had been breached, what we saw was that companies could take the risk profile of the breached third party and use the risk scores to run those risk scores against their entire universe of third parties that were in the system, and be able to identify who was at similar risk because they happen to have very similar risk scores. What do you think about that approach in terms of leveraging data science?
You know, that's nirvana. I'll give you a specific example that is factual. And when COVID hit, it was probably mid-March last year, and one of the first things I recognized is that our offshore suppliers that were dealing with customer information had to, by mandate in their countries, had to work from home. Now, financial services as an industry, which has typically mature third-party governance programs on a relative basis, just largely due to regulation and breadth of risk, they've never, no one in financial services ever encouraged a third party to encourage resources to work from home.
Right.
And the reason for that is that when a third party offshore resource is working in a development environment or a call center environment, there are other people around, and those other people around can observe behavior, and they can actually enforce behavior. So, for example, if I'm a third party and I take out my phone and I hold it up to the screen to take a picture, if I'm in a call center, I may not be allowed to have my phone. I may have to
Absolutely.
put it into a locker, right? Or if my supervisor is sitting across the table, he's going to say, Jim, what are you doing? Right? So there's an inherent control that's applied just through socialization, right? Well, now, if I'm working from home, which I have to do for health reasons, it's the right thing to do, I still have access on my screen to sensitive customer information. And now I have a vehicle for taking it off network that's not monitored, and there's no control for it. Now, look,
Right.
we at the company I was at previously, at Mass Mutual, we told our third parties, have people work from home. Absolutely. Put infrastructure in place, including, pay for their last mile if that's what you need to do, but do the right thing from a health perspective. Now, while you're doing that, I need your help, because this is unprecedented. We don't have any controls for this. So we brainstormed together some potential controls. We came up with one. Was it great? No, it wasn't great. Was it better than nothing? Yes, it was better than nothing. And so what we said is, give us a name. This is the enterprise asking the third party, give us a name of every employee that you've asked to work from home that has access to this customer information, and give us their IP address for their home network. Yeah. And we had I'll say 500 to 600 people in that category, in that segment, and 5 companies. And so we talked to the 5 companies. 4 of the 5 companies said, absolutely, be happy to do that. As a matter of fact, we're going to notify them that we're doing this, so they're fully aware of that. And of course, the enterprise, and us, in our case, we said, great, that's a prophylactic right there in terms of that control, because they're aware that we're going to take their information, share it with a third-party intel provider, and if they find dark web activity that's typically indicator of fraud, they're going to notify us, and we're going to notify the supplier, who's going to notify the individual, and everybody in that chain became aware that this was going to be implemented. The one of the 5 vendors said, no way we're doing that, and for privacy reasons. So we implemented this over, it might have been 6 or 7 days, right? Later, we actually implemented it for all 4. And the 5th one, a week later, decided that they were going to throw their lot in and say, oh, we're willing to do that now, because we see others are kind of following the lead. Now, the extension of the attack surface that was the result of an event, in this case, the pandemic, triggered an increase in risk that was managed within a couple of weeks of implementation, because of the community, and everybody recognized that it was a different ballgame with a different set of rules. Well, look, those same vendors today are still having their folks work at home. They're healthy because they can work at home. They're enabled. They're not destitute economically because they can work. And so far, we've had no major, I don't have real-time data, but we've had no major incidents as a result of it. And that's a way for a community to come together and deal with a change in the attack surface, all triggered from the risk.
So, Jim, that's a great idea of adding another data source, in this case, the IP addresses of those work from home team members. Jim, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the conversation we were having regarding automating risk actions. So let's follow a couple of examples. So, these three are actual alerts that have happened recently regarding certain third parties. The first one is a financial risk alert about a drop in credit rating. The next one is a geopolitical alert regarding a weather pattern. And then the final one in this case was regarding a patch management update. So Jim, talk to us about a little bit deeper. These are some examples I know that you and I have talked about. How does one actually start a program like this? And then secondly is how do you then scale that to apply across these different risk categories?
Yeah, so the first place that I would start is looking at the universe of third parties for an enterprise and deciding how to categorize the types of products and services from a risk standpoint into specific categories. So I, in the last two enterprises that I've worked in, had 8. I think the first time I had 7 categories, and then the second time I had 8 categories. I don't think there's a right number of categories. I think what you have to do is group them. So for example, offshore, we talked about offshore service providers with access to sensitive customer information. That's a category. What does it mean? It means that that category has a specific set of controls based on the risk profile of those in that category. All right. Now, high risk software, commercial software providers, that's a different category. They look nothing like offshore third-party services, right? They're different. They have a different risk profile. There's a different set of control requirements that they have. And they're a product firm versus a service firm, right? So, and by the way, one of the categories that you need to think about today in light of SolarWinds, which with supply chain poisoning, one of the categories you have to think about is repository management SaaS services. So you may have a category of SaaS services or SaaS service providers that are used by the enterprise, and maybe you have some way of determining the highest risk relative to the data that's shared. But somewhere in that domain, if you will, that subcategory, you've got to have repo providers, GitHub, GitLab, BitLocker, or Bitbucket. These are what developers are using to access open source code components, and they're joining into these communities through a SaaS service that, oh, by the way, that SaaS service today is probably not part of your third-party governance program, but should be part of your third-party governance program as one of the lessons learned from the SolarWinds breach, right? So, and maybe you want some specific controls in place, like identity access management controls that's unique for them. That becomes a category or a domain. So figure out in your universe how many domains that you want from a risk standpoint, design the specific controls for that category, and then measure the compliance to those controls as one of the factors that goes into the risk score for the vendor, for the individual entity in that category. And then ultimately add data and as many sources of near real-time data as you can, so that you have multiple dimensions of risk that are all feeding into that risk score for the vendor that ultimately then you use to establish thresholds and trigger action. So the basis is really universe, subcategories based on risk, control, specific control requirements for each category, then the vendor risk score, which is a composite of the categories plus other real-time sources of data that you have, and then the trigger to automation of workflow that's non-human dependent that closes the loop, and then the humans step back and look at the whole thing and say, where do we need to focus our time?
Yeah. So Jim, one of the key takeaways from the conversation you and I had last week for me was, when you think about supply chain poisoning, and I actually like that perspective because when you start thinking like that, it makes you spend time and effort recognizing where in my supply chain, in my third party delivery, can part of that supply chain be poisoned, just like the example that you talked about. Where is that code that your teams are leveraging? Where is that coming from, and the probability of that potentially being poisoned? So it kind of makes you rethink your attack surface from location to cyber to financial, because you're really thinking about how can something be poisoned or challenged.
Yeah. So in the SolarWinds thing, and look, there's been a lot that's been written about it. You've read about it. You've consumed a lot of information about it. I'm just going to make it very, very simple. The threat actor, who's a sophisticated nation-state sponsored threat actor, very familiar with working in the Ukraine and in Russia, was trained as a criminal, and also had development expertise. What they did is they used a password, SolarWinds 123. Now, my guess is all of you recognize that's a simple password, and that password was probably guessed, and that's how the penetration happened in GitHub. But the real skill that was applied, and this comes from the development experience, is that the Sunburst, which is the backdoor that was malware that was created, was made to look just like all of the other code components in the repo. Yep. So it didn't stand out at all. It looked exactly like a SolarWinds professional developer put this together, and then it got packaged through the pipeline for distribution as an update. And the stealthiness part of this was the skill and expertise of camouflaging the software to look like it came from the development team. And they bought it. They believed it, right? And what I just described sounds very simple. It is, but it's highly likely. Like, it's very possible to do this. Look, there are limitations to passwords. We've known about that for a long time. And once you've defeated a binary control like that, you're in. You're trusted.
Right.
So as long as you act and behave as expected, you can stay kind of in stealth mode, which is what happened here. So the reality is, what do we take away as an enterprise? Number one, apply better identity access management controls and password complexity to the DevOps teams that are setting up accounts in GitHub and GitLab. And we know how to do that. There's no mystery there. We know how to do that. Second is the SaaS provider that's doing repo management. It's a third party. Make it part of your third-party governance program. By the way, it wasn't before, right? We never heard of SolarWinds before. I never heard of it before, right? And my company was using it, right? Shame on me. They weren't part of my third-party governance program. Do that today. The third thing, which is if the first two fail and you're a victim of supply chain poisoning, again, which has a pretty high probability, especially now that the criminals all are sharing information about how to do this, right? So the third thing is a little bit more innovative, I guess, but also there's some risk associated with that in terms of the technology. It's new, which is workload runtime protection. And there's 6 companies today that offer that capability. There'll be 16 over the next several years. It's a thing. It's a category of thing, and it basically is using some machine learning algorithms to monitor workloads. And when workloads do things that break a behavioral pattern, again, we're using data science here, then there's either an alert or a block. You choose. You can set it up to alert or you can set it up to block. And this is runtime protection. So if a backdoor gets installed, similar to what happened in SolarWinds, in your workload, whether it's running on the cloud or running on-prem, it doesn't matter. You run these agents, if you will, pieces of software. And I encourage all of you to try out using these capabilities and get better at it, and basically start out with alerting and then eventually go into prevent or block mode. This is ultimately how we're going to have more confidence in our software supply chain.
So Jim, all these activities, some of course automation, but we talked about moving to continuous monitoring, expanding the risk aperture, leveraging data science. And so one thing we recognize is, while risk manager is a hard job, as Bloomberg said a few months ago, but the amount of work, the tax that's being put on these risk professionals is rising. So one of the polls that we wanted to quickly do was, for all the risk leaders on the call, when you think about your organization, do you have enough people to meet the current operational risk requirements? Yes, no, or you are planning to do that, as Jim is recommending and we are recommending, is to use automation to be able to manage that. So please, to the audience, please answer the question. Do you feel you have enough resources to meet the operational risk requirement? I'm going to let it be open for another 10 seconds. And then Jim, love for you to comment on kind of your personal experience and compared to what you are seeing from the audience. So let me end the poll, and Jim, I'm going to share the results.
Yeah, so about 20% of people say yes, they have enough resources, and about 12.2% of that 20% are delusional. Now that's Jim's opinion. I have to make it clear that, and there's no statistical research to back that up. But I guess I'm not surprised by 53% not having enough resources. I never had enough resources, and frankly, one of the hardest things to do, and this was related to a question that Ed, I think, raised earlier, is you really have to the enterprise and all your stakeholders, you're the champion of operational risk and third-party governance. I'm making that assumption. You basically have to say, look, we're going to make some investment. And the reason we're making some investment is because we're decreasing the unit cost of our ability to support third-party risk going forward. Now, don't say anything about risk, right? Don't say anything about threats or anything like that. It muddies the water. Just very simply, you're going to provide some investment in terms of software capital and people, and you're going to redesign processes using data science. And the outcome, the reason you're doing it, is to get a lower unit cost for your program. And that lower unit cost comes from fewer people. And it may take you 18 months, 24 months to do that. But that's the outcome. That's what you want to do. You want to actually shrink the amount of operational costs in your third-party governance program. At the same time, the risks are going up. But I don't want you to focus on risks, because you're speaking a language that all your stakeholders understand. Invest money today to get a better return that's sustainable tomorrow. That's the formula. That's exactly what you use. Now, inside of that, you're building this data science foundation. You're using some software and data feeds in real time to give you lots of attribute information. And you're then connecting the outcomes from a risk standpoint to the automation. And once you have that implemented, you can do all of this with fewer resources than you're doing today. And the fewer resources you have are going to love their jobs a lot more, because they're going to feel like they're making a material difference in improving risk management. But I don't want you to tell the enterprise that that's why you're doing this. That's an outcome. The reason why you're doing this is to lower unit cost for your programs. And the reason I'm encouraging you to do this, it's easy to get money in an enterprise to do this. Don't tell anybody, but it's easy. You just have to stick to that formula.
And you've got to bring these functions along with you, Jim.
Yeah, frankly, operational risk, third-party governance, they're one and the same. Like, it doesn't matter how you're organized, you're birds of a feather. And then, of course, the procurement process and ways of making that more effective and efficient. You've got lots of stakeholders that have a vested interest in this outcome, and it benefits the entire enterprise.
Thank you for that, Jim. So Jim, I know we addressed a number of questions from our attendees today. There's many that we may not be able to address today. What I'll do, Jim, is I'll reach out to you and hopefully get the answers, and we can post them for everybody. But maybe to end this session, Jim, I just wanted to kind of reinforce certain messages you said. And if you feel, please feel free to add to that. I think we started with talking about, think about what you can automate as you are bringing in continuous monitoring across a very comprehensive or a wide risk aperture. And then ensuring by using data science and automation mechanisms that you're actually reducing the noise so that your risk professionals are truly focused on this integrated view that they are getting, automation taking care of a significant number of those actions, but the risk professionals being focused on key escalation activities. Jim, any final words you want to leave the audience with as they take this journey that you have just kind of explained, which you have done twice before?
Yes. There's a life cycle here that you have to recognize, and it's very similar. You've seen this across other dimensions across the enterprise, and maybe have seen it in third-party governance as well. The more data you have, especially near real-time data, the more ideas and thoughts you have about what to do with that data. So be careful and don't get caught in a trap where you're consuming data, providing context for that data, and thinking about all of the ways to use that data and maybe other data sources that you'd like to use. Until you connect the risk driver to the workflow automation, you don't have a way of realizing the economic outcome that you're seeking. So that part is really important. And so as you find more data across multiple dimensions, which gives you lots of information that you can respond and react to, be sensitive to the fact that you want to connect as much through automation of the workflow as possible, because that's where you're going to be able to realize the benefits. That's where you're going to be able to shrink the unit cost for the program and expand the coverage. If you don't do that, then you're just feeding more data into your current resource scarce team. So that third step is the part that's the most essential to realizing the business benefits broadly across the enterprise.
Jim, you've absolutely reinforced, like I said, what Bloomberg said, risk manager is a hard job. And I think the journey that you described enables risk managers to actually deliver significant value to their organizations when it comes to resilience, and most importantly, the protection of that revenue that these companies are aspiring to. To the audience, once again, thank you to Jim. This recording will be available soon on crowisdom.com. And as I said before, we'll make sure that the questions that were not answered are answered and available to you on both Jim's LinkedIn and also Supply Wisdom's LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone. And I look forward to our next session. Thank you, Jim.